Hello everyone, this is my presentation, a simple game of chess in the Slingshot peer teaching series. Now you might be wondering, why am I qualified to give a presentation on chess? That is, if you haven't yet played me on the Slingshot Discord. My qualifications are the following. I have a tall trophy. At the time that I got it, it was actually taller than I was. I've played 3,000 games of Ultra Bold on Lichess. Ultra Bold is the game mode in which you get 15 seconds to a side, so it's quite hectic. And I've spent over a decade of my life on this game, so I'd better be good at it. My presentation is going to go something like this. We're first going to talk about the key ideas, such as how the game is notated, and then how you can evaluate a position, so things such as material and how the pieces are positioned. Then finally, we're going to go over a few openings, including their general principles, a respectable opening, and then a few dubious ones. A quick note on questions. It is awkward to talk to myself for half an hour to an hour, so feel free to ask questions at any point, and I will be asking you questions which I expect answers to. So now getting into the key ideas. This is chess notation. So a quick rundown. On the left side, we have the move. So first move, second move, third move. The first column includes white's moves, and then the second column includes black's. So I would recommend having this presentation open. I've put a link on the Slingshot Discord, which you can access a PDF. Then I will also post a link to the study on which we will be doing pretty much everything. Right, so looking at this, let's break down this first move. So we have e4 and then e5. So here's a chessboard. You can see that we have the columns labeled with letters, and these are referred to as files. So the A file, the D file, the G file, whatever. And then vertically, we have the rows or ranks, which are numbered. So this is the first rank, the seventh rank, the fourth rank, and so on. When we look at any specific piece of notation, like for example, knight f3 here, it is in the order piece, file, and then rank. So the pieces are as follows. For a pawn, you put nothing, and for a knight, you use n instead of k, since k is taken for king, but otherwise fairly self-explanatory. And then you include the file, so the column with a letter, and then the rank, the row with a number. As you can see on this chessboard, for white, it goes from left to right, the bottom to top, and then if you're playing black, it's a bit more awkward to keep track, but you get used to it. Then there are a few special symbols. For example, if a move is a check, we'll put a plus at the end, or if it's checkmate, we'll use a hashtag. And in some cases, we'll have two pieces which can move to one square. Like imagine if this knight was on c1 instead, then both knights could move to e2, barring the pawn in the way that is. So we would have to specify which knight is. So we could say c knight to e2 or g knight to e2. The disambiguation is not something you have to worry about too much. So we can actually run through this now that we know how notation works. So e4, e5. Should probably flip the board for our viewing experience. So e4, since there is no letter, we know that it's a pawn move, specifically a pawn on the e file. So to e4, this is the only pawn that can move there. And then e5, so it's going to be this square, move a pawn here. Then we have knight f3, knight c6. So knight, this is the only knight that can move to f3, so there's no need to specify, just knight f3, and then knight to c6, so c6. Finally, bishop c4, followed by knight f6, so bishop c4, then f6. We'll notice that I'm clicking the pieces before actually finding the squares, because as a chess player, you get so used to some of these moves, especially these knight moves to the center, that you don't even need to think about it. You know where knight c6 is immediately. And then if you click this down the rabbit hole link there, Lichess has a fun little game where you have to identify coordinates as quickly as you can. It's fun to gain some familiarity. I'm not going to go through it right now. So we went through our breakdown. Now, this is the key part of any chess game, being able to evaluate the position and tell who's winning, who's losing. This is even more important than, well, really anything else I can think of, because whenever you make a move, you need to be able to say, is my position going to be better after the move? Would it be better after A move or B move, and so on. So let's discuss material. And when I say material, I'm referring to the collection of pieces on the board. So we have a way of evaluating pieces so that we can sum it up and say how much material a given player has. And it is all built around a pawn having a value of 1. So the minor pieces, the knight and the bishop, both have a value of 3. And then the major pieces, the rook and the queen, the value of 5 and 9 respectively. And that makes sense for the queen because you can think of her as like a rook and a bishop put together with an extra point for being a single piece. And of course, these numbers are fairly arbitrary. These are well accepted and won't lead you wrong, but if you are so inclined, you can go down the rabbit hole and click this link to a Wikipedia page where there are a ton of different value systems, including some that change based on what part of the game you're in, endgame versus opening or whatever. We can take a look at this position and say who is winning using purely the piece evaluation. So does anyone have an idea of who's winning here?
Black?
Yeah, so black is up. We can see that we both have a rook, so 5 points. We both have 1 pawn, but then white has a pawn as compared to black's knight. And a pawn is worth 1 point, while a knight is worth 3 points. So we can quickly say, oh yeah, it looks like black has an advantage in this game. And of course, this is somewhat oversimplified because you have to consider positional factors and what's actually happening on the board rather than just the pieces on it. But this gives you a quick idea of who has an advantage. Oh no, I just clicked far ahead. All right. So that brings us to the next point, which is how do I not give away material to my opponent for free? So the struggle that many new chess players have is that 1, they're fairly aimless in their play, but 2, following from that, most games are decided based on who gives up less of their material for little to no compensation. And I think there's a 2-step loop which can take a new player quite far, which is thinking about your opponent's move and then making a move. And that sounds really simple, but each of these has several components that we have to consider. So to evaluate an opponent's move, we're going to consider 2 things. Did my opponent's move create any threats? And a threat is anything where, say, if my opponent was given another move right now, they would do this and it would give them an advantage, such as material primarily. So is the piece that they move threatening anything? And also, does it open any lines? Like, for example, if you move a pawn, the pawn might not be attacking, but moving the pawn might reveal the bishop or some other piece. And then second, did my opponent's move change my threats? So maybe you're threatening something and they added a defender to it. Or maybe they moved a piece out of the way. And it's also worth quickly considering, was the move safe? So are they moving somewhere to a square that they control? Maybe there's even an opportunity to take a piece. So the key idea here is that as long as you track the changes from move to move, there won't be any surprises. Because in the starting position, we have 2 sides that are completely isolated and there are no threats. So as long as you track the threats and say, okay, I've created this threat, my opponent has created this threat, this is resolved, you will know at every point in the game exactly what is going on and what you need to worry about. Now let's do an example problem. We are playing black in this situation, and white has just made the aggressive move knight g5. And since this is not a starting position, I'm going to quickly give you a rundown. So it looks like we have 2 knights out, 2 of them are facing towards the center, but there's not too much happening, except now a knight has been moved over to our side, and then white also has their bishop out. Anyone see what white is threatening to do? If we gave them another move, what would happen?
Is it knight f2? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, so as you can see on the side, since this is on black's side, this is the 7th rank rather than the 2nd, which is of course one of the confusing pieces of playing black. But yeah, if I make some aimless move like a5, all of a sudden white is going to take on f2. And this is a dangerous move because the knight is threatening both the rook and the queen. So I'd only be able to protect one of them. And as you might remember, these are major pieces, so they have a very high value and you don't want to give them up that easily. And then the one thing that we might want to consider, because when you're thinking about your opponent's next move, you want to go through a few just in case. So they could also take with the bishop. Either way, they have two things attacking the square and the king can't defend himself. But this move would be weaker because it doesn't then create that double threat, which is known as a fork. Okay, so we know that whatever we do, we need to prevent white from taking on f7. So yes, it does threaten something. And then how do we deal with that? That's actually something we're going to touch on later in this presentation. Now let's talk about how you make a move yourself. And we have an even longer list of priorities here. So are there any threats that we need to react to? Like, for example, that knight move. Do we have any threats that we can act on? And no, you can think of this as pretty much a linear progression, because if there's a threat, you're probably going to stop there and deal with it. Or if you can do something, you're going to stop there and deal with it. So if there are no threats that we need to consider, the next thing I'd say is, which of my pieces are weak and can I improve them? This is a difficult concept to grasp. So we're going to touch on it later when we evaluate how a piece is positioned, but generally we're thinking about how much space a piece can control, how many squares it can move to, that sort of thing. And then which of my opponent's pieces are strong? Can I push or eliminate them? So for example, can we maybe kick a bishop from a square? So I have an example somewhere. So for example, here we have this aggressively positioned bishop and the white player decides to kick it away with a pawn. Now, maybe this is not the best way of going about it, but this is an example of the principle. And then finally, can I create any new threats? And note that creating threats is prioritized under strengthening your pieces and damaging your opponent's pieces, because a lot of the time new players want to check. They want to put their pieces where they can take something. But often that is going to lead to punishment down the road if you single-mindedly attack. It's very important to think about how your pieces are positioned first. So now we are in the shoes of the white player, and black has just made a bishop move. So does bishop c5 threaten anything? Remember, so this is the c file, the 5th rank.
So, Sasha, are you talking about black threatening?
Yeah, so we've just made our knight move, black reacted, and now before we act on our threat, we need to think, is there anything we have to worry about here?
I guess the pawn with the king, right?
Yeah, so here we do have the bishop threatening the pawn. And the easiest way to decide whether or not that is something we need to worry about is saying, all right, so if the bishop takes, how can I react? Oh, I can just take back, and then it's a pawn for a bishop. So we're not too worried about that. And in a lot of positions, you're not going to be too worried about your opponent's move. There are a lot of moves like this that just fall into the category of improvement. So had a bishop that wasn't doing much, now has a bishop that has the potential to do more. But ultimately, we're not super concerned about it. And then as we discussed here, we're threatening to take on f7. Does bishop c5 do anything about that?
Don't think so, no.
Yeah, so we're completely fine to proceed with our plan and take. Here, this is really a dry situation. You might be saying, Sasha, why are you making me look at this? I know he's not defending f7. I want to take the pawn, damn it. Well, how about, oh no, I need to actually click. Okay, how about this? So you'll notice this is a slightly different position. A pawn has been moved. We have another knight out, but same idea. We're threatening f7, but our opponent just moved bishop g4. Does bishop g4 threaten anything?
I guess the queen, right?
Yeah, the queen. And then the next question is, does bishop g4 change my threat? And it doesn't. We can still take on f7. And now we get into the next step of chess planning, which is thinking, is my threat bigger or is his? So if I just take this pawn and don't react, he's getting a queen for a bishop. So I'll take the pawn, that'll be 1 point. He'll take my queen, that's -9, so we're at -8 total. But then I could take his queen, so we'd be positive again. But then he could take the pawn and so on. And this is where calculating becomes difficult in chess because we have to determine the tree of moves and think about everything that could possibly happen. So here, I would probably go for f3, just putting a pawn between the bishop and my queen, because if he takes, then I'm getting a bishop for a pawn. And if he retreats his bishop, I'm probably getting the f7 square. So now we're going to get into positioning now that we have an understanding of threats. So in this example, we can see that both of these knights in the center are very strong pieces. They cover a lot of space, especially contested space in the center. And having such pieces allows you to easily pivot to wherever you want to be on the board. Conversely, we can have weak pieces. So this is taken from a game between Stockfish and AlphaZero. Both engines really like making their opponent's pieces fairly useless. So if you take a look at AlphaZero in this position, the black pieces, which of his pieces are not doing much?
You said black, right?
Yeah, black.
I would say both rooks and both bishops are kind of just blocked off.
So it's pretty much a trick question. Black has more useless pieces than useful ones. This bishop is pretty much a tall pawn. He's defending the rook, defending the pawn, good for nothing. This bishop has nowhere to go. There's a knight in the way, there's a pawn in the way. This rook is accomplishing nothing. If this rook moves, the knight will take it. See that AlphaZero is very choked off as compared to white, who has this really powerful knight that is preventing the rook from moving, and otherwise has a fairly open position where you can easily bring out a bishop, bring out the queen, and so on. So this is how you go from the first level of chess, where you're very focused on material. You're thinking, how can I take my opponent's free pieces? How can I prevent, or how can I not give away my pieces for free? The next step is thinking, how can I get my pieces to the center? How can I impair my opponent's development? And generally, the key here is taking space in the center. So in most classical openings, like here, we had very common pawns vying for the center. We have several minors aiming for the center. We have a bishop aiming for something aiming for the center. Often whoever controls the center is going to have the stronger pieces. For example, here we can see that all 4 center squares either have pieces from Stockfish or are empty. And in fact, Stockfish is contesting this empty square. So this makes it easy for Stockfish to place a knight here and have a lot of power over the board, while conversely, AlphaZero is cramped and has nowhere to go. Or in this previous situation, both of these powerful knights are in the center. And this bishop's aiming at the center, these bishops are aiming at the center. So in general, controlling the center is a key idea and is an easy way of measuring your positional power. Now, I'm going to introduce a bad chess player, which is also me, but from 10 years ago. So this is when I was not the greatest of players. We're going to be looking at some of my earliest archived games on chess.com. For some reason, I can't see the ones when I was truly terrible. Perhaps the archive system hadn't started back then or something. But I've still got plenty of bad games. So here's the first one that we looked at a tiny bit of earlier. And we're going to just go through this and break down some of the threats. It's like we're half an hour in. So my opponent opened with g4. And you'll notice this gives us an opportunity to control the center because they aren't doing so. So I played d5, which I think is a pretty good move. I still would probably play this. And then my opponent continued by developing a bishop. And here is the first move where it's useful to think, okay, is my opponent threatening anything? A minor just came out.
Yeah, pawn d5, right?
Yeah, pawn d5. So does my opponent want to take this pawn? And we can quickly say, oh no, they wouldn't because my queen is defending it. And the next question is, what am I threatening? Well, we can look at my pieces that are actually mobile. The queen's not really going anywhere. The knights don't have anything close enough, but this bishop can take the pawn. And being the young and greedy child that I was, of course, oh no, I just skipped to the end. I am no good at scrolling, apparently. Being the young and greedy child that I was, I took the free pawn. Who wouldn't? And now my opponent makes a move. Once again, we have to analyze this. So f3. Of course, it's a pawn, it has close proximity to my bishop. So we have a threat to react to. We know that this bishop has to go somewhere. I just chose to move it back. Now, can anyone think of why I would choose to move to this square, f5, rather than any of... No, scrolling is beyond me. Can anyone say why I would want to move to this square instead of any of my other options? Yeah, I literally brought an external mouse so that I could right click properly.
Because this still keeps you open to attacking, right?
Yeah, so this is the strongest square for the bishop remaining. Like if I move it here, the bishop's a tall pawn. Here, the bishop is like stifling my other pieces. This is back where we came from. And this move might look good because you're thinking I'm going to stay on this diagonal. But often with bishops, if there's a pawn chain facing them, they can't do anything. Unless if this pawn moves, this bishop is never going to be able to move in this direction. So we move to f4. Then my opponent makes a move. And this is the kind of aimless move you'll see at low levels. It's very useful to be able to tell between an aimless move and a move that is quietly accomplishing something. So looking at h4, we can think, does it create any threat? It's a pawn, we just have to check here. No, the pawn doesn't. But perhaps the pawn is opening up something, like how when moving the d pawn, that lets my bishop out. Am I worried that his rook is going to come out? Not really. So we can say, yeah, that probably wasn't the greatest move. So I just moved a pawn so that I could get my bishop out. This is a pretty common opening idea. We'll see this. In the opening, we're really focused on getting our minor pieces out, and maybe castling. So nothing too exciting. My opponent has moved his pawn again. So this reveals a new square for the rook, but it's also covered by my queen, so not too worried. And the pawn's not threatening anything. Apparently, I decided that this warranted a reaction, so I pushed g6. And now my opponent is pushed his pawn yet again. I really like seeing new player chess games because it was just a different time. It's really enjoyable. So I saw that my opponent has pushed on once more. It's not doing anything. And I decide whether or not I can attack this pawn myself. So I have a bishop and a knight as compared to his rook defending. So I realized, yeah, I can take the pawn. Why I chose to do so with the knight, I don't know. So whereas bishops are often useful at the edges of the board, so this bishop has a pretty strong diagonal. There are a ton of saying like a knight on the rim is grim, a knight on the side is fried, and some more creative ones. This knight isn't going anywhere. There's a pawn covering it. There's a pawn covering it, and then my own pieces are in the way. So this is the way that you can make a really simple decision, such as taking a pawn, and make it more complex. as you start considering more things. So sure, I have a knight there. And now my opponent has played d3. Does this create any threats?
D3.
Yeah. So he moved the pawn up.
Oh yeah, the bishop's open now, right?
Mm-hmm. So here I am thinking it's a pawn. It's not attacking anything. We're good. So I just go on my way. But what my opponent is threatening, as Ak pointed out, is that this knight is now being attacked by two pieces. So first question, is it worth it for him to take? If he takes here, so knight, he would be up 3 points. I'd take, we'd be even, except now this bishop would be here, undefended, and my rook could take. I mean, his rook could take. And all of a sudden, he'd be getting 2 minors, a knight and a bishop, for the low cost of 1 minor. But I ignore this, and then so does my opponent. This is welcome to low-rated chess. Things are going to be fairly uneventful for a while until I randomly decide to bring out my queen. New players really like bringing out their queens because she's a powerful piece. If your opponent doesn't know what they're doing, your queen can go around and take everything. As a general rule, we don't want to bring the queen out too early. We'll touch more on that later. But sure, I brought my queen out, put her in arguably a better position. So note how aimless our moves have been. My opponent pushed a pawn nowhere. My opponent moved a knight that really doesn't accomplish anything with the queen here. What would be, say, a better move in this position?
For black?
Yeah, for black.
Maybe take another piece out, like the knight.
Yeah, certainly. We couldn't even go back to our list of priorities and consider. So are there any threats? No. Can I act on any of my threats? I don't have threats. Which of my pieces are weak? We're on step 3. So this knight isn't doing much. These rooks aren't doing much. And the queen, she's okay, but I mean, like even here, I have far more options. This knight is not great. I wonder if I could reposition it. And so as we discussed, you want to move things towards the center. So the simplest move would just be getting this knight out from the back rank to c6. Be an easy way of improving my position. But no, aimless pawn moves. And then this queen move is potentially problematic. My opponent thankfully just moved his pawn, but for example, if this bishop had been moved out, then white would be pretty much getting a move for free. This is what we refer to as tempo. Whenever you make a move which forces your opponent to do something, you pretty much get a move for free. So for example, this queen comes out, the bishop is here, and then since he's attacking my queen, he's created a threat that I need to react to. I move my queen somewhere. Now we're pretty much where we were, except his bishop has moved out. So that is generally the concern about bringing out your queen early, that your opponent can easily threaten her and you are forced to react. But sure, as a new player, we're making more aimless pawn moves. We're taking free material. And now finally, my opponent realizes that this bishop can take the knight. So we have this f4 move, which creates multiple threats. And this is a situation you'll be in many times in chess games. So, I mean, we're going here. We're saying, does my opponent's move create any threats? Is the piece threatening anything? Does it open any lines? In this case, both are true, and both often can be true in the best attacks. So this pawn is attacking my pawn, but also his bishop is no longer obscured. And as we discussed earlier, this knight is being attacked. So bishop takes, knight, bishop takes, rook takes. He'd still be winning that fight. And now, if I do something with my knight, like move it here, his pawn can take. Though note, this is not a big threat because the pawn will be taking a pawn and then will get taken by a pawn. So it's a fair trade. What is my best move in this situation? Any ideas?
Knight f5.
Yeah, knight f5. We can actually get both birds with one stone. This knight has to get out of the way, and we want to get rid of this pawn. Just take. Brilliant. But beyond me at the time, apparently. So if you can just break down threats, you can get actually quite far as a chess player. Because here, I've just given my opponent a minor piece for nothing. And I'm back to my aimless queen. So as we discussed, we could be developing a knight, we could get a rook out. We have options other than moving the queen around. Then you also have to worry about having tunnel vision when you threaten something. So here, I moved my queen thinking I'm going to eat this juicy b2 pawn. And my opponent moved his knight to g5, which creates a threat on h7, because now the rook is attacking it and the knight is attacking it. The king can't really defend it himself. So in this situation, I don't really have a way of defending this pawn, which is a cause for concern itself. So I just take. He takes. And now my opponent really should have gone through the checklist right now and thought, okay, so I can either take and win a pawn, but what is my opponent threatening? When he took b2, he's threatening, oh, look, my rook, which is worth 5 points. So had they seen this, they probably would have attempted to defend the rook. Does anyone have an idea how we could do that? So white to move and defend rook.
Yeah, just remove the knight.
Yeah, so there's this block connection. We just move the knight. And now the rook is protected, all is well, and he can take my pawn next turn. Now we're just taking each other's material, and the game really devolves from here with my opponent handing off more material, me taking a pawn, and I think everyone can start tragedy is about to strike. Moral of the story, don't be like me. Think about your moves, think about your opponent's threats. If you can just think, my opponent is giving me material for free, and take, you can hit 1200. Note that this is a 10-minute game in which I didn't even use 2 minutes of my time, yet I came up with some gems like this. Don't be like me. My opponent actually has a checkmate in 1 here, which he didn't see. But this is checkmate. And if you are so inclined, there are more games in this study that I posted a link to. We're probably not going to look over them in this session, but they might be something worth breaking down and seeing how a little bit of common sense goes far. This game I want to touch on quickly, though, because I brought out my queen on the 3rd move. So this is a prime example of why we don't bring the queen out early. I don't know why I chose this square. Maybe I wanted the pawn or something. He brings out his knight to defend the pawn. Now my queen is still here and she's looking kind of dumb. Now, look, this knight is attacking my queen. He just got a free move. I move my queen here. This pawn is attacking my queen. He just got a free move. I move my queen here. His pawn is attacking my queen. He gets a free move. I move my queen here. His knight is and you see how this goes. His bishop. This is just terrible. My opponent just developed 3 of his 4 minor pieces completely for free because I was flailing my queen around. And apparently I resigned at this point. I don't know. Maybe I was concerned about his development. Maybe my mom was telling me it's time for lunch or something. But black is definitely in a bad situation here. For those of you who are going to play chess further after this lecture, if you're ever looking at a game of yours, you can use Stockfish to see what computer thinks of the position, and it will also suggest some lines. So here we can see this is plus 6.5, where the points are meant to be roughly aligned with material points. So even though the material is even here, Stockfish is saying that white's position gives it 6.6 pawns worth of value more than my position, which makes sense given these really well-placed pawns, the miners actually being out, and so on, because often you can capitalize on a position and turn it into material. Like if white were to move their queen here, I would have a really hard time defending myself because all of my pieces are cramped and stuck. Right, so that is evaluation in a nutshell and positioning. Now we're going to talk about openings. Particularly, we're going to start with the respectable openings. And we're going to go down the rabbit hole quickly. This link will take you to the Lichess Opening Explorer. This is a brilliant place to go, and it's the reason that I'm actually not going to spend much time on openings. The key ideas are just get your miners out, control the center, and castle, with the optional start with e4 or d4. E4 or d4 are generally the friendliest moves to new players, because playing e4, you have your bishop can get out, your queen can get out, and you're placing a pawn in the center, controlling a square in the center. D4 is similar, except it's the other bishop. And both of these moves, there's a ton of theory around them, and there are good, simple openings for which you don't have to be too worried about traps or anything complicated. So you play d4, usually your opponent will play d4, and then you just start developing your pieces. So like whatever, we have all of our minor pieces out, we're ready to castle. This is a good start to the game, and you don't have to worry about anything for the first few moves. One thing of note in this position is note these knights. These knights cannot move because they are pinned to the king, which means that so if I were to move this knight, I'd be in check. And since I can't put myself in check, this knight is immobilized. And often pins are a source of tension in openings that you can take advantage of. For example, we know that this knight only has one defender, the pawn, and he can't move. So if we put another attacker on the knight, all of a sudden this is a concerning situation. So now the knight still can't move, but is being attacked by two things. How do you even defend in this situation? You just castle according to Stockfish. Stockfish doesn't even think it's worth defending because you're just going to take, all of a sudden you're up a pawn. So pins are often something to keep track of. Nearly every basic opening will have some pins which can be exploited, either to the queen, in which case you can move the knight, but you generally don't want to because it's a queen for a minor, or the king, in which case it is truly immobile. So general game plan, as we said, minors, pawn in the center, knights towards the center. You want to castle at some point. And now you're off to a great start, especially if your opponent is doing nonsense. If I were to sum this up in one sentence, we generally use the one-touch rule, which is where you want to avoid touching any piece twice in the opening. And that brings up the question of what is the opening? Generally, the period before you have all of your minors out and you've castled. So it's kind of circular, but it's a rule of thumb. One particular opening I want to highlight because it served me well for years is the Queens Gambit. Now, the Queen's Gambit goes as follows: d4, d5, and then instead of just getting started with bringing your bishop out or your knight out or whatever, you play c4. Can anyone suggest a move for black in this position?
Take the free pawn.
Yeah, take the free pawn. And now this is what is known as the Queen's Gambit accepted. So black has just removed their pawn from the center. So now I have two pawns in the center. My pawns are creating a barricade. They're powerful. And I've opened a diagonal onto this pawn. And this pawn is going to be a pain to defend. Does anyone see a move which can be used to defend this pawn? We have two options, both of which aren't great. We can either put our bishop on this really awkward square where it's going to block the e-pawn. You can see this has never been played in a Masters game. And we can simply block it with a pawn. We just got a free move. We're going to get the pawn back. Everything's great. Or you can play b5. And this gets into what we refer as theory, which are long, well-studied lines in chess books that are generally complicated and have a lot of pitfalls. The easiest response is just to threaten it and note that they can't defend it, because if we take and then they take, all of a sudden there's a free rook. I note I'm simplifying this slightly, but the general idea is that you can't hold after this defense. You can see big win rate for white. And a lot of new players are going to accept the Queen's Gambit without flinching. They see the pawn, they take the pawn. Another thing I like about the Queen's Gambit is that even if they don't accept, there are relatively simple lines, and you don't have to ever be stressed about your opening or know a ton of different opening lines, because as long as you keep the fundamentals in mind, you're going to be mostly okay. Like the Slav is popular, and then it's a super boring game. You can see 66% draw rate. Of course, that won't be true at a low level, but you just trade off and then start developing. Good, simple start to the game. But that's no fun. Who wants to play actual analytically sound openings when you can play dubious, or as I prefer to call them, novelty openings? And we say novelty whenever we have a chess move that is unique or unusual. A lot of the time, unique means bad. And these are openings that will put you at a disadvantage against an experienced player, but they're a lot of fun, and they're even more fun when your opponents are not ready for them. So let's go through a few. First is the fried liver. It's a classic. I don't know where it got the name, but I would not be surprised if it is because you are going to be frying your opponent's liver. It goes something like this. It's actually that line we looked at earlier. So knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, and now we bring out our knight. So we're not going to ignore the threat this time. We're actually going to think about how can we try and prevent it. What can we do here to prevent f7 from being taken?
Use the queen.
Yeah, so we can use the queen. And this puts us in an awkward situation, because if he takes, we can't take back. So we'd be trading a queen for a bishop and a knight. And then he's also getting a pawn. So that's 1 + 9, 10 versus 3 + 3, 6. So our opponent would be gaining material. But the rook can just be moved over. We have a knight that's infiltrated. But oh, look, now we're attacking the rook again, and they're just in a better position. Stockfish seems to want to move. So chess computers like getting stuck in loops like this. Chess has a rule where if any position gets repeated 3 times, either player can claim a draw. So chess engines will sometimes loop and say, okay, maybe he won't notice this time. Maybe he won't notice this time. Oh, not taking a draw. But as you can see, we've got a +3. We got a pawn. It's kind of awkward to not have an f-pawn. It's awkward to not be able to castle. This is not a good situation for black. But we don't have many other options. So we can't defend with the queen, can't defend with the knight, can't defend with this knight, can't defend, can't defend, can't defend, can't defend. So it looks like we have no options at all. However, can actually play d5. This is what is considered the main line. And here, white generally just takes. I think you might have seen the response, the correct response, which is playing knight to h4. And this is a counterintuitive move, because your opponent has just taken a pawn in the center, which you can take back just fine. If you take, it's going to go takes, takes, takes. That's what you're expecting. You just equalized, your queen is well positioned. What's not to like? But apparently The correct move according to an engine is this. Makes you wonder if there's something deeper, damn it, going on. Should probably promote this to the main line. Right, so knight takes. Now here is the key move in the fried liver. Actually, I'll give you a chance to spot it. What can we do in this position? What do you think is going to be the key move that fries your opponent's liver?
As white,
Yes, as white.
I would play knight f7.
Yeah, screw it. We're going to take anyway. So even though the bishop's not protecting it, we're going for it. And okay, he just took. Guess that didn't go so. But wait, we can bring more pieces into the attack. So we're now attacking the king and the knight. And note that the knight now has 2 attackers on it. So let's put this up. So our opponent has to respond by bringing his king closer. But now we can bring another knight into the attack. So we have 3 attackers. He's going to bring his knight out. And interestingly enough, Stockfish wants to castle because it gets the king out of the way. This is an absolutely wild position. It requires accurate play from your opponent. King's in the center of the board. You have 3 pieces out. You're going to get a rook out. You're going to get your bishop out. You're throwing material. You're burning your material for a chance at a killer attack. And a lot of the time, your opponent is not going to notice right here. You're going to get away with this in some rating ranges. So the correct move is this. And what I like about the fried liver compared to a lot of these other dubious openings is that even if your opponent knows what to do, you're not in trouble. It's 0.3. That's still white's general advantage. Like right off the bat, you can see white's at a plus 0.2, or excuse me, white's at plus 0.2 before making any moves because first move advantage. You're not really giving up much by trying and seeing if your opponent will make a mistake. Whatever, we're going for a check. We're going to trade some pawns. We're developing. Nothing too unusual is happening. And similarly, there's the fishing pole gambit. So notice e4, e5, this is what you should be playing. White will generally bring out this knight first, because if they don't react, this pawn is up for grabs. Stockfish actually wants to go for the fried liver here, you can see. What? Oh, for some reason this is a fried liver. Excuse me as I take a sec to figure out what I'm doing. Oh, yes. Okay, so, oh, I see. I have it in another tree. My apologies. We're going to make this the main line. All right, so we have just made an aggressive knight move. Does anyone see a preferable move to knight g4?
Bishop c5.
Yeah, bishop c5 is an option. In particular, I'm trying to bait someone to saying, hey, isn't white e-pawn free? Because it is. That's a free pawn. But it's a type of pawn that is not only free, but poisoned. So we just ate the poisoned pawn. Now, when white moves this rook over, all of a sudden we're in trouble because he's attacking our knight. And if we move our knight out of the way, oh no. Now our pawn is getting taken and he has a rook in the center of the board. We're quite cramped for space. It's not where we want to be. This is why I prefer to play. This is why I recommend d4 and the Queen's Gambit over e4, because there are a lot of tricky lines like this. Back to the fishing pole. This knight is the bait. We just made what looks like a useless knight move. The knight, while it's threatening these squares, we don't have other pieces out to take advantage. But I would make this move, h3. We want to kick the knight out because it's a free pawn move. The knight's just going to go back, right? And then later, when I develop a bishop, this is going to be a square I might want to move my bishop to. So h3 is preventing that, and the pawn's covering here. So my bishop is a lot more limited. But now we set up our fishing pole. We have the bait, we have the fishing pole, and this looks like a free knight. You take the knight, you take back, and now white realizes that they are in trouble. Their knight is being attacked, and let's say you move your knight to the safe square here. Black just won the game. Try as you might, you cannot defend against this. The king is like in a tomb constructed of his own pieces. So if you try and make an escape square by like moving this pawn, we're going to be able to move our pawn up and choke them. Or if you do anything else, it's just mate immediately. So what white has to do is say, okay, this knight is not making it out alive, and just prioritize king safety. So then see, we're at a -2. That's the right move. We get a bit into the fireworks again. I think this is the main line. But white's castle has a hole in it. We have a powerful rook with an open file. And this is going to be a game where white is on the run the whole time after a seemingly innocuous h3 move. And there's also the possibility that white ignores the fishing pole. Maybe they just play whatever. Honestly, you're not too worried. You can just take back the knight whenever you'd like. So it's another one of those tricks where you're not giving up too much. And now to wrap up, we're going to get into some truly wild lines. Just make sure, okay. Some truly wild ones. So there's the Halloween Gambit. It starts innocuously. This is what's called the 4 knights defense. Everyone just gets their knights out. You have e4 and e5 on the board. But then the Halloween Gambit is this sacrifice. You take the pawn, and of course he's going to take the free knight. But then you push up, and all of a sudden you have 2 pawns in the center, and the ability to get your bishops out as compensation for your knight. Maybe he moves here. This knight now has nowhere to go. Can't go here, can't go here, can't go here, can't go here. Has to go back. So you're at a disadvantage because it is a bad opening. But you've got counterplay. You can get your bishop out, you can get your queen out. It requires quite accurate play to stay alive. And now we get into an even worse opening, the Jerome Gambit. What is the typical next move in the Jerome? Oh, fun fact about the Jerome Gambit. There is a blog where someone has chronicled thousands of games and he's made thousands of posts about the Jerome Gambit, which has, I believe, a 37% win rate. And this is not at the highest level. It's just a super dubious opening. So if you're like me and can't remember chess openings, it's very easy to look them up and see what happens. So we have bishop c4, knight d4. And then, so note that this is not a super common line. It gives white a bit of an advantage, but you do see it. So instead of taking or even taking the free pawn, note this is another example of a pawn that looks free but actually isn't. Instead, you say, okay, I don't need this bishop. Bishop takes f7. Then when they take, this isn't the classic Jerome. Sorry, I'm not going to cover this since I do not quite remember the line and it's a mess. This is another fun attacking line. And then one final opening, which is my favorite novelty opening, the Grob. So instead of pushing one of your center pawns, you open like this. And it also has a similar opening, b4, which is called the orangutan. And hilariously enough, this has seen a play in games between grandmasters. like a serious New York tournament qualifying for the World Championship, where a grandmaster visited the zoo the day before, played b4, and then in an interview claimed that he talked to an orangutan that told him to do it. So the idea of this opening is that your opponent says, a free pawn. But now what? Do you see the trap?
Trap for black?
Yeah, so they have just taken this poisoned pawn. Why is it poisoned?
Oh, gotcha. The bishop can move to g7.
Yep, there it is, free rook. And of course, it's unlikely to go this well. Might play bishop here, and then if your opponent takes, you just traded your g-pawn for a center pawn, which is a great trade. But your opponent might do something like this, in which case you could solidify, you can do whatever. It's kind of a weird one that gets the occasional win. I like using it at a high level because opponents are expecting common openings and you get into a chaotic off the book kind of game a lot faster when you play garbage, but not straight up losing garbage. You don't want to give up your ability to win. Right, so that is just about it for my presentation. I've got a few resources linked here and in the PDF that I post on the Discord. Lichess is an absolutely amazing website. If you want to learn anything about chess, you can probably do it here. So there are the very basics, as I suggested before. There is practice, where you can see stuff like checkmates, tactics, more advanced tactics, even some endgame material. There's the analysis board, which we looked at. So anytime you play a game on Lichess, you can then analyze it afterwards and learn from your mistakes. So let's see if I can grab my most recent game. Apparently I lost a game of Blitz. Oh, I remember this game. I don't want to talk about this game. Look at Crazy House. No, that's not, this is not normal chess. If you are into variant chess games, as you can see that I very clearly am, when was the last time I played a real chess game? It's been a while. Okay, it's a game against a grandmaster. I won, not to flex. So we go to the analysis board and we're saying, okay, let's see what happened in this game. Could I have played better? We can request a computer analysis. This is completely free. You get a server-side analysis of your game with way stronger computers than what I've got here. Can even learn from my mistakes. So in this situation, apparently I took the pawn, but I can do better. Oops. Right, so what could I have done better in this situation? I have no idea. Well, I can see the solution. And in this situation, I actually don't know what I could have done better. I would not have made this move. This is one of the disadvantages of training with chess engines. They have very slow, careful moves that humans don't necessarily think of because computers can be 600 steps ahead. We can't. But in general, it can be very useful to see where things go wrong. Ooh, that's where I went wrong from apparently. And get an idea of how you can improve your game or what alternative moves and strategies you can follow. I also posted that link to the Opening Explorer. If you're like me, or if you were like me 10 years ago, and you didn't know any openings, but you wanted to be a tournament player, you had to hit the books. Nowadays, you just go to the Opening Explorer, and you can instantly see what grandmasters are playing in the Queens Gambit. See, okay, so it looks like, I want to learn a new Queens Gambit line. How about, actually, realistically, masters don't play d5. You can see the most popular move is like knight f6. So you can see what you can, what sort of openings your opponents will play at a high level. So here, you can see they're not even engaging with me in the center. They're just going to let me do my thing. And then they're going to set up their bishop over here, a castle, a wild. This is actually one of the most common responses I see when I play the Queen's Gambit. It's a great way of exploring openings. And finally, puzzles. I love puzzles. Puzzles are awesome. Lichess's puzzles are particularly great because you can choose specific themes. Like maybe you're looking for opening puzzles where there are traps. So like here, I can see when I take the queen, the c7 is no longer protected. I can fork the rook and the king. I'm an idiot. I just missed straight up checkmate and lost as many rating points as I deserve to for that. You get the idea. Puzzles are great. Lichess lets you target specific themes and improve parts of your game. Thank you for showing up. Here are a few of the footnotes that are better presented in the PDF because this was generated from like a markdown document. Thank you for showing up.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sasha. This was very cool. I mean, you can stop recording.